So I guess you were in the same position as me, one of the people who couldn't find any videos directly comparing these two cameras. Until now. Call me crazy, but I want to find out how a $500 Sony a7 compares to a 3 times more expensive a7 III. Without further ado, let's see how this turns out. As for the body itself, I think the biggest difference is in the weight. The a7 III is heavier by about 200 grams, and admittedly, using both of them, I definitely felt that. I guess it is the price to pay for that steady shot stabilization inside, which of course I will test later. But the newer generation is also a bit bigger, and that applies to the grip as well, which was often criticized in the previous model. Personally, I got somewhat used to the one in the original a7, but indeed I can confirm the Mark III's grip is more ergonomically friendly. Generally, the whole structure of the body, button layout, and for example the shutter button are placed a bit more conveniently. Also, it's easier to clean thanks to the use of different materials. But in the end, is it really enough to counterweight the lighter and more compact body of the a7 Mark I? When it comes to the viewfinder, the weird thing is that some claim it hasn't changed throughout those 3 generations. But on Sony's website it clearly says the a7 has 0.71 times magnification, whereas the a7 III has 0.78 times magnification. This is the only difference, the rest of the specs stay the same. And looking at this footage, it seems to be the case. Though my experience with comparing those viewfinders was rather brief, so I can't fully judge here. I don't have major complaints, both are good, but to be honest, nothing like one in my Panasonic G9. And I'm not even talking about the screen itself, but the external part of the viewfinder. In Sony it is rather small and covered with harder rubber. People wearing glasses will understand. On the back of both cameras you will find 3-inch LCD screen with exactly the same resolution. What many people won't mention, however, is that the anti-refractive coating of the display is different. And this actually seems like a downgrade from the original a7, and where Sony made some savings, I suppose. On the flip side, in the a7 III you will find a touchscreen, but it only works for focusing, so this whole implementation seems a little cheesy. Also, given this camera records in 4K, Sony really should have gone with fully articulating screen. Fortunately, they've done so with the Mark IV. Autofocus wise, just to give you an idea, the a7 II was already a bit better than the a7, and the a7 III was much improved in comparison to the previous models. But in reality, all of that does not mean the autofocus in the original a7 is bad. It rather depends on the lens you use, and in fact I would argue, for most conditions it's decent enough to get the job done pretty much on par with the newer gear. Especially if you're like me and you often shoot locked in center in single autofocus mode. Of course the a7 III is significantly better, but I think you will notice that mostly in more demanding conditions, not necessarily in landscapes or portraits. For example, here in worse lighting you can notice standard a7 starts to lose that speed a bit. And on a side note, the shutter mechanism sounds more solid and premium on the a7 III, and with that, let's compare a few JPEGs side by side first. So I set both to the highest settings, 24 megapixels, extra fine compression, and as you can see both perform pretty closely, with maybe a bit lighter colors coming from the original a7. However, the often mentioned difference in the color science is indeed more broad. Here, Mark III's pictures come out as more saturated and more accurate, whereas the standard a7 looks a bit washed out in comparison. And even more so with this one. Much more pleasing look coming from the newer camera, even when it comes to the exposure. Here, perhaps the difference in the color science is more subtle than you would expect, but sometimes it is really the nuances that matter really. Again, just take a look at the background, the difference is small, but enough to justify saying the a7 III captured this scene more accurately. And looking in the crop, searching for some difference in the level of detail and sharpness, I am not able to spot any. And even this landscape came out extremely similar, but we'll get more in depth when it comes to the dynamic range with the raw files. Again, I can't see a difference in the crop, both are satisfyingly sharp. So starting with the first raw, let's get into the crop on this log. Not much of a difference when it comes to the level of detail, but also each camera definitely focused on something different. And it was probably the Mark III which was a tad more accurate here. Another beautiful scene captured by both cameras, maybe a subtle difference in terms of the color tones in this flower, but that's beyond the level of nitpicking really. In the crop the amount of detail seems to be about the same. Finally some landscape, and to test out the dynamic range I've already maxed out the highlights and shadows in this one. The first thing I notice is again the colors. The original A7 seems to often display that kind of a greenish tint, which is thankfully not the case with the newer generation. Other than that, I'm not able to spot any differences in the level of detail or noise. Unfortunately, this day was full of sneaky clouds, so it was pretty hard to capture exactly the same scene while changing the lens and settings in both cameras. Anyway, again, highlights and shadows are maxed out. The A7 favored details in the sky area, while the Mark III exposed this light a bit more. Still, overall, I don't think there is a huge difference between the two in regard to the dynamic range. I would say both are crazy good, and as much as I love my Micro 4x3 camera, I can honestly just dream of such results. Here, one of the nicest shots I captured, which also accurately represents probably the most noticeable difference in daytime image quality, the color science. Though gotta admit, the greenish tint on the original A7 actually looks quite interesting in this case. When it comes to the lowlight performance, I think they are relatively comparable up to ISO 1600. The A7 III seems to have some edge over the older model, but the difference is not groundbreaking. That said, the farther you go, the better results you will get from the newer camera. Just see for yourself how they compare at ISO 3200. Even more so with this one at ISO 6400, you can clearly see just how much less grain comes from the Mark III. Finally, ISO 12800 and 25600 gives you an idea about the overall A7 III's advantage in the low light performance. So I can confirm that the Xomark score was totally right about this one. And moving to what's most interesting for me, videography, let's start off with stabilization. On paper there is a huge difference between the two. The A7 Mark III has 5-axis sensor stabilization, whereas the first generation A7 has none. Is this a deal breaker? In short word, no. In reality, I'm not able to spot any major advantage of provided stabilization system. Maybe it can be helpful for stabilizing some smaller movements, but overall it is quite seriously limited. In contrast, the difference in autofocus speed and reliability in the Mark III is far greater than when shooting stills, and it is especially noticeable in continuous autofocus. I haven't done extensive testing, but many people say it is actually one of the best autofocus systems for video, which may quite likely be true. But truthfully, all of this does not matter much, since the video quality per se is not even comparable between the two. See, standard A7 provides with maximum resolution of 1080p, which was just too low a standard even 3 years ago when I've tested it for the first time, not to mention nowadays. In terms of movie quality, this aspect is very outdated. 1080p videos looks blurry, having mediocre amount of details and by far not the best sharpness. I wouldn't recommend getting this camera for video recording to anyone. 4K is a must-have in my opinion. Besides, just take a look for yourself. Even for Full HD it looks pretty blurry, to be honest. Easy win for the A7 III. It's a beast, but I just wish its stabilization would work more efficiently. Now let's take a moment to conclude and briefly look at the Sony A7 lineup. So of course, firstly there is the baseline A7 with 24 megapixel full-frame sensor, the ability to record 1080p up to 60 frames per second, it weighs 474 grams and costs about $500 on the aftermarket. Then for about $250 more you can get the Sony A7 II, featuring exactly the same sensor, but this time stabilized in 5 axes. Apart from less money in your wallet, another price to pay is the extra weight. And next is the A7 III with the same resolution but apparently newly designed sensor and much improved autofocus system. As we observed, it clearly delivers slight improvements in the color science and much improved low light performance. Offered 4K recordings look stunning, but the lack of 4K 60 and proper stabilization is a bit concerning from the videographer's perspective. And finally, there is the latest A7 IV with a totally new 33 megapixel sensor, added digital stabilization, even more improved video quality and 4K 60 option. Though sadly, it comes with a crop. I won't elaborate on this model since I haven't got my hands on it yet, and frankly, it is even too expensive to talk about for the sake of this comparison. So what would I recommend doing? Personally, I think it would be most sensible to skip the A7 II, buy the original A7 and invest the rest of the money in some good lenses instead. Yeah, you get slight improvements in ergonomics and 5-axis sensor stabilization, but honestly it's not that big of a deal, especially the stabilization. With or without in camera with such a big sensor, you will be still in a very favorable position for shooting stills indoor. And honestly, in the end, I don't think this sensor stabilization is effective enough to make a significant difference in lowering the shutter speed number. Upgrade to the A7 III on the other hand seems much more reasonable. It delivers much better low light performance, one of the best autofocus systems and slight improvements in color science. Not to mention, despite some concerns, it becomes at least an option for videographers thanks to the 4K. But ask yourself, how much of that do you really need? For example, let's say you're only shooting stills outdoors. Apart from the different color science, chances are you probably won't notice advantages in between any of these cameras. So it really depends on the use. And just please remember, for that $1,000 of a difference, you could instead get some really killer lens. And that would be all for today. I hope this comparison was helpful, and if you like such content, please rate this video and more importantly consider subscribing to the M Galaxy. Share your opinion on both cameras in the comments. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.